All right. So, myth of the grand bargain. And really, the origin of this talk is a question a medical student asked me actually during a Snap chapter presentation, probably about, I don't know, 8 years ago or so. And the student was concerned that regulation of prices would result in less breakthrough drugs, less market innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. So this led to some research and not by myself, by folks who have been doing this for some time, and hence this talk. Today we'll talk about that myth, successful and unanticipated consequences of Bayh-Dole, which and Hatch-Waxman legislation, which will probably be new to most of you. We'll talk briefly about how drug companies game the system to maintain monopolies, and some recent legislation and proposals to rein in drug prices. Everybody can see this okay? So I think you may have seen this fellow before. This is a patient of mine who started Lispro insulin. This is the same guy who was denied his diabetes care by Anthem for pre-existing conditions. But in '96, he started Lispro, which is a humanized insulin made from E. coli bacteria. It was a breakthrough product, a humanized insulin. We didn't have to worry about antibodies, the decreasing effectiveness of the exogenous insulin. It's priced at $21 a vial, which was not cheap at the time, but it was affordable. Less than 10 years later, the list price has jumped to $93 per vial. 3 years after that, it goes up another $30 without any change in manufacturing costs. In fact, costs have come down for its production. It was booming in sales. And again, 5 years after that, its price has doubled. And that's if you are not covered or uninsured, as you'll learn about PBMs, pharmacy benefit managers, the actual price to a lot of folks and insurance natures will be less. But curiously, although generics were now available in the United States, the generic drugs were not cheaper. So what's going on here? If you go across the border, however, it was a reasonable price, $32 a vial. Still more expensive than when it was first released, but maybe some of that has to do with inflation, maybe profit. So essentially, as you might know, and other than in the VA or the Medicaid systems, no U.S. law regulated the cost of any drugs. In fact, Medicare Part D prevented regulation or negotiation for the cost of drugs. And again, these are slides you've already seen. We have a pricing failure in the absence of a monopsony in the US, with nobody minding the store and supposed free market processes underway. We lead the world in the cost of drugs. This is from 2019. That has not changed yet. And I don't think it will change, although I think the differential will come down. You have most of the industrialized nations towards the right side of the graph. But many of those industrialized nations, Norway, Poland, Israel, Denmark, Spain, they're mid portion to the chart and to the left. So clearly, and I like this. This is from the Health Cost Institute. They have similar ways of looking at the cost of pacemakers and other devices in the United States compared to the rest of the world. Here's again looking at factor 8, what you're seeing here. Can you see my cursor? You guys able to see my? Yeah, okay. So factor 8, again, this is South Africa, Holland, UK, United Arab Emirates, all compared to the United States. If we price our costs at 100%, how do they pan out accordingly? Immune globulin. Now, these are some newer drugs, some checkpoint inhibitors. Again, helpful drugs for cancer management, all less expensive. The only outlier here, this is a drug for cystic fibrosis, Calideco, Invecaftor, that stuff, Ivacaftor. So they probably don't see a lot of cystic fibrosis in United Arab Emirates, For some reason, that is more expensive there than elsewhere, but everywhere else, this also applies to all of the NOACs, not just rivaroxaban, but also apixaban, etc. So again, stuff you already know. And again, what are these costs? As Steve really brought home, these health policy issues have major effects for our patients. Many of our patients skip doses, they don't fill prescriptions, and of course, we have the highest mortality among OECD nations related to amenable conditions. This is contributing. It's certainly not all of it, but it's some of it. So if the Kaiser Family Foundation did a recent survey of those who say they have percent of those who are receiving medications in the past 12 months, 20% have not filled a prescription because of cost. 12% have cut pills in half or skipped doses due to cost, and almost 20% have also decided to take an over-the-counter drug, some of which might be identical. That's a good idea instead. So the percent who did not take prescription medicines as directed was 30%, and that's a reality. Again, effects on our health. If you look at the number of folks greater than age 55 who skip meds, this includes Medicare patients as well as juniors. Of course, we're way above the average, which would sit in here for OECD nations. So why do we allow these prices? I'm sorry, I'm going to try to see what's in the chat. Oh, that's a good question. It depends on the dosage. So Chris asks, how long does a vial of insulin last? If you're taking 2 units, it depends how many. So it depends whether it's U100 or a lower concentration. People do not dilute insulin. You can't do that. It results in breakdown of the insulin product. Insulin needs to be refrigerated. So it depends on how many, if you're taking, for instance, long-acting glargine insulin, people will often, who have insulin resistance will often need to take 100 units of insulin a day. So you're going to be going through that bottle in probably 2 weeks. If you're taking 10 units a day, it could last you a month. So it depends. Does that make sense, Chris? It's also my way of my relative ignorance, since I don't self-administer insulin. So I think somebody who uses it could tell you better. But that is part of it. Typically, it will last, I'd say, on average, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the insulin and the dosage. So why does the U.S. allow these doses? So this is the myth. If you pay high prices for our innovative drugs, we'll sink that money into the research to create more new wonder drugs. And if you believe that lower prices will thwart innovative research, then high drug prices and innovative research by the major drug companies must be inextricably linked. This is the misinformation that's been widely promulgated successfully, including to medical students, that the pharmaceutical industry has accomplished as to explaining why we do indeed lead the world in innovative drug research, and that's a true statement, but we'll see some of the other reasons that are more accurately explaining that. In fact, if you asked executives who worked for the pharmaceutical industry, is that true? What are your prices based on? This is what they'll tell you. So pharmaceutical executives admit that research costs do not determine drug prices. Quote, estimate of income generated by sales is the #1 consideration for price, or anticipated income stream based on what can be charged, not the repayment of sunk costs, is the primary determinant of price. That only makes sense. These are Wall Street traded, stock-based industries, as Dr. Lection has discussed in terms of stock buybacks. These CEOs have a fiduciary relationship, not to society or patients, but their stockholders, to maximize their profit. So that's what these are. These are for-profit companies. This is their mission. This fellow, Ray Gilmartin, who is a CEO of Merck, told the Wall Street Journal, the prices of medicines is not determined by research costs. Whether Merck spends $500 million or $1 billion developing a medicine, it is those paying for our medicines Who will determine its true value? I love that. No, in other words, the industry charges what the market will bear, and value correlates with profit and stock price. So again, just recently, I don't know how many of you read in the paper about Bernie Sanders writing a letter to Novo Nordisk. They're there in Denmark, producing some of the recent breakthrough drugs of our time. So just this past April, Sanders requests, and he writes a letter to the CEO of Novo Nordisk. Why are the prices of Ozempic and Wegovy so high in the US? And both of these products, by the way, are semaglutide. They're identicals. Ozempic and Wegovy and Rybelsus are all the same drug. They are the same identical molecule at different doses. So the pen for Wegovy delivers a higher dose than the pen for Ozempic, which is Ozempic's for diabetes. Wegovy is just the same molecule. Instead of limiting it to 3 milligrams, you can go up to 6 milligrams. So these are not new drugs. They were approved in 2017. They were a tweaked glucagon-like peptide 1 agonist. Many of you have, how many of the medical students here are familiar with this class of drug? Right. So you're seeing a lot about these. These were derived actually from the venom of the Gila monster. Actually, if somebody is, this is a researcher in the Bronx by the name of Eng discovered this. Um, this was back in 2005, was the first GLP-1 agonist. These are great drugs for diabetes and for metabolic disorders, but they ain't new. Gila monsters ain't new, and these drugs go back almost 20 years. So Novo Nordisk replied to Sanders, well, it's easy to oversimplify the science that goes into understanding disease and developing and producing new treatments, as well as the intricacies of US and global health systems. There's a two-letter response, which is BS, and reply ignores the question of price differential. Again, promoting the myth, it's the science rather than the profit. If you look at these products in their first launch, their first release, so this is not exenatide from 2005, but this is semaglutide in 2017. So how much, how do I get rid of this thing? Get out of here. Get out of here. Um, Wish I could anybody know how to minimize this bar? I'm sorry. So when first released, basically this is France, Germany, Italy. These are your OECD nations, and of course the two colors to the right. This is the big four: VA, Department of Defense, Public Health, and Coast Guard. That's here, and this is a wholesale acquisition cost for the other markets. So clearly we have a differential in cost. But not only is it marketed initially at a much higher cost, same product made initiated in Denmark, but the first changes occur so that they're dropping in cost. The first average price changes for diabetes and obesity drugs with some are in. So if you look at all diabetes and obesity drugs, they're in this dark blue bar here. And if you look at the price change after introduction of semaglutide, they're in this lighter purple bar. In OECD nations, the price went down, except for the US, where the prices went up because we allow it, and purely based on markets. So once upon a time, so in a previous era,
Dr. Dr. Dokar, I had a quick
yes,
question.
please, yes, thank you.
Sorry.
I can't see you guys, so please do
Okay, I
interject
figured.
as you
Okay.
can. Yeah.
Um, when the manufacturers are looking at that international comparison, the graph you were just showing us,
Yes.
are they basically saying to themselves like, "Okay, this is just what the market? It's a different market in all these countries, so this is how we justify it. It's a different market." And so, are they just basically just thinking that Americans just have more money to spend compared to the other countries?
Well, in fact, from what we've seen with the statistics, I don't know what they're thinking, other than they're also, these are being traded on their wall, on markets. Novo Nordisk is on the American is on Wall Street, and is traded throughout the world. These are for-profit companies. What you and I know is that many Americans cannot afford this. In fact, there's a real crisis in terms of obesity and managing obesity. So part of what we know is that the American public cannot afford these drugs, right? I mean, I think that's the take-home message of a lot of what we've been presenting. People skip their drugs. They actually cannot afford drugs. They go on GoFundMe for chemotherapy, right, and a variety of other things. So
Right.
there's two different questions you're asking. What's in the head of the CEO of Novo Nordisk? Well, I think what I'm trying to get at is they have a responsibility to their stockholders. They are the CEO of a for-profit company. That's their mission, right? So what they're thinking is, yeah, we can get away with it in the United States. They are not controlling the cost of our product. We will price it at the highest price the market will bear, right? So those who can afford it, those with insurance, those who have on Medicare having or whatnot, the PBMs will negotiate these prices. And by the way, the insurance companies who are paying the prices for these drugs, they care a little bit, but not very much because they just raise the premiums if the price is unaffordable. Okay, so it's an interesting question. Are we wealthier than developing nations? You bet we are. Um, does the average citizen in the United States have more expendable income, which is really another question? Not necessarily compared to other developed nations, right? We're spending it on housing, so it's a complicated question. Did I sort of answer your question?
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
yeah, I was just wondering, like when they look at that, it's a very stark contrast of like what the costs are for the same molecule, in a different country. So I was just wondering how they're
no,
justifying that to themselves when they're making those
absolutely,
decisions.
absolutely, and an important observation. And I think the difference is not necessarily in how a product gets released in a free market in Denmark versus the United States. The difference is somebody's minding the store and saying this is unaffordable. We're going to put a price limit on that. We have to control the price. Does that make sense? As to the yeah. Yeah. Uh, so I grew up in New Jersey, and when I was in medical school, Merck was not far away in Piscataway, New Jersey. That was a major pharmaceutical house. And back in that era, before 1980, the pharmaceutical houses actually did invent our wonder drugs. Academia invented many of them. They were doing ongoing research, but many of those same academic researchers were in the pharmaceutical houses. So these products, the first statin, lovastatin, the first proton pump inhibitor, omeprazole, the first serotonin reuptake inhibitor, fluoxetine, Prozac, they were all developed actually by the pharmaceutical houses back in the day. And part of the reason is there was less incentive for academia to create new drugs. Prior to 1980, patents from that resulted from publicly funded research were actually remaining in the public domain. There could not be a monetary price if it came from taxpayers' dollars. So it limited the incentives of academia to create new drugs to some extent. And one of the things that was happening in the 60s and 70s was a frustration in the United States with the slow introduction of new drugs. So this is a reality. We're talking about realities and myths. Incentives include monetary incentives for the production of novel molecules. So academia was somewhat hampered by that lack of incentive. This was explored, and for better or worse, a Democratic senator by the name of Birch Bayh and Bob Dole, who's a Republican, came together to create the Bayh-Dole Act, and this did create changes in technology transfer. After its passage, tax-funded researchers were allowed to patent and commercialize discoveries of the new molecular entities coming from their research, and to license them to drug firms. It created a mechanism. So universities and nonprofit researchers were given a uniform process of transfer and licensing. The National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, NCI, other government institutions were allowed to receive intellectual property licensing fees and royalties. And as a consequence, many startups developed to create these products, often folks who are working at universities who part of their time is spent at a startup. And these technology transfers were successful in developing novel drugs. Now, you can make there are legitimate arguments that this is a weird way to do it, and we'll talk about that later. Um, but in terms of innovation, it probably was quite successful. Now, the National Institutes of Health, by the way, does not share in these, or academia doesn't share in the profits made by the drug once it's marketed and released. But they do see at least something for their products. And of course, even though these products come from tax-funded researchers, that doesn't make any difference in the exorbitant costs. One thing that we'll talk again about further, I'm not sure if Gabriella will touch on this, is this Bayh-Dole Act does include a provision that allows the government to march in and break a private monopoly in the event that a drug maker fails to make this drug available to the public on reasonable terms. It's a very interesting, and that was sort of a bone thrown to the Democrats in the passage of Bayh-Dole to say, oh, wait, don't worry about exorbitant prices. There's going to be a mechanism to prevent that. Well, that mechanism has almost but never been used. This is from the drug industry. This image talking about the amount of trillions it's gained to gross industrial output, inventions discovered, patents issued, jobs, etc. Um, so if Bayh-Dole did change everything, and it did to some extent, who's doing that groundbreaking research now? Well, it's no longer the pharmaceutical houses. Pretty much all novel molecular entities have origins in research done either in academic settings via National Institute of Health, National Cancer Institute, or via small academic affiliated startups. So the NIH funding contributed to basic research for every one of 210 new drugs approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2016. And the taxpayer grants to doing the science to create those included more than $100 billion. There were people are familiar with first-in-class drugs. These are actually novel breakthrough drugs that actually change the management of a disorder. So there are 84 first-in-class drugs developed by the National Institutes of Health, or their funding during this period. It wasn't all done necessarily in Bethesda or whatnot. And again, we discussed the potential to break patents that's never been used. So just a word about clinical research. Gabriella, do you touch on clinical research at all?
I was still like fine tuning my presentation
Sure.
based on what you touch here. So you take care of whatever
Okay.
you want to do. I don't want to step on your toes or
No,
anything.
no, nor me on yours. So, thank you. And by the way, Nirali did have one slide that touched on the various stages, but I do want to spend a minute about clinical research. How many of you have been involved in clinical in drug research? Any folks here, either as a participant, uh, getting paid for phase one trials, and anybody here? I know Nirali was involved in that, but okay, maybe so. So the phases of clinical trials. There's preclinical, and this is where novel molecules are invented and discovered. You learn about the physiology, you learn about the cell receptors, you learn about the intricacies of downstream functions within cells, and you come up with an alpha block, or you come up with other agents. That's all done in the universities or NIH. Okay, this is a promising new drug. This looks exciting. This is a checkpoint inhibitor. Wow. Let's see what we could do with that. We have an effect of reducing cancer proliferation via the immune system. Wow, we do a lot of stuff. Let's do some human safety studies. So that's phase 1. You've got a drug in animals. It's working very effectively. This is a breakthrough product. How does it affect people? So basically, those studies are being done at the National Institutes of Health and typically academic startups, and they will be working with tens, maybe 20, maybe 30 people. Not usually diverse. These are people who are paid because this is a totally experimental program. You have to look at the ethics about how safe is the product and how much knowledge, how much informed consent the volunteers who are entering into these phase 1 trials are aware of. But you're finding out about the pharmacokinetics. You're finding about what's the maximum tolerated dose. I think the next slide will have some of that. So that's a phase 1 trial. You'll get to expanded safety trials and start to look at efficacy. So here you've got some animal studies showing dramatic efficacy. Most of these volunteers in phase 1 trials do not have the disease that you're treating. That's usually the phase 2 trials. Now you're taking volunteers who are willing to, based on this knowledge, subject themselves to the risk about an unknown with a new product, but also with the benefit of perhaps treating a serious disease. So this is still done typically at NIH and with academic startups, but typically with academic, often, not always, with academic research organizations. These are for-profit or actually, academic research organizations are non-for-profit. These are companies that are set up to help with the design and implementation of this research trial. Then you get to phase 3. This is when Big Pharma typically takes over, and they will be often running these trials. This is now dealing with thousands of people. The licensing has happened sort of up here. That's when the license may get transferred if Big Pharma is interested. They're going to provide funding throughout this period here. Big Pharma will often use for-profit contract research organizations to do these studies, looking at more safety issues. So really only after the preliminary tax-funded studies appear does Big Pharma buy the licensing to pursue further phase studies. A National Science Foundation has done studies looking at this, and drug companies spend only 1.3% of their revenues on the basic research to discover new molecules. So we know they're not doing that. But the question is, how much are they spending on these clinical trials? Pharma exaggerates the research cost with claims of billions of dollars to bring a drug to market. But in fact, of interest, and this blows your mind what they get away with, part of that cost is what they call opportunity cost. So they'll take, oh, we're putting in $100 million to do this study. This is a big study. This is 10,000 people over, in 5 states. But what they're using is we're taking that $10 million, and if we put that into the stock market during the most robust period of gains in the stock market, we could have made $100 million. They're actually putting that into the cost of their research, what they would not have made if they had invested it. So there's a lot of shenanigans, as we'll see, and some of which you heard from Dr. Lecton as well. In fact, the average drug cost to bring a new product to market is about $90 million, not billions of dollars. And here's Dr. Letchens, who is involved with some of these studies. Avorn is another researcher in this field. So just to reiterate for your own medical knowledge, phase 1 clinical trials, establishing drug safety, establishing dose ranges and pharmacokinetics, We're working with tens of numbers of volunteers. By the way, oftentimes these volunteers have to be in the hospital because they're getting their blood drawn every hour. So they have a hep lock in one of their veins and then just having the blood draw every hour. It determines the maximum tolerated dose, and that does not produce unacceptable side effects. And of novel molecules that are promising, about 70% of drugs will pass that phase to go on to the next stage. Again, phase 2 clinical trials. Now, does this drug improve the outcome if you're living with a disease? What's the best doses to affect that outcome? What's the dosing intervals based on the pharmacokinetics we learned in phase 1 trials? And this is often dealing with 100 to 300 volunteers, no longer paid necessarily if they have the disorder. And of course, these are also randomized double-blind trials lasting several months to a couple of years to confirm, or rather, that the drug is actually effective. And about 33% of drugs will pass into the next phase. Clinical trials phase 3, again, they remain randomized double-blind studies. Now you're dealing with up to thousands of patients over many years. And this is where the package insert on the FDA will gather most of the data. This is looking at efficacy, safety, side effects, and 25 or 50 to 30% of drugs will pass these phases. By the way, if you've heard of phase 4 clinical trials, this is after the drug has been licensed and marketed and released. These are post-marketing observational trials, no longer double-blind trials, but trying to find if there's any side effects that were not determined in a wider, more diverse population than that with the earlier studies. Sometimes they're required by the FDA. Aducanumab, which was a drug for Alzheimer's, which has not really panned out, required that phase 4 clinical trials, in fact, resulting in being essentially taken off the market. So anyhow, that's a lot of detail, maybe more than you needed, but we'll get back to the myth. So here's what, based on all those clinical trials, this is what the drug manufacturers say is their allocation of revenue. So between 2011 and 2018, again, this is a slide you may have, similar to what Dr. Leshchin may have shown. Manufacturing, that's actually probably an overestimate. That's the startup cost for manufacturing. Once the conveyor belts are stamping out the drugs, not going to cost much to continue to manufacture them. Marketing, again, that's an underestimate. Probably this is an older slide. Profits, remarkable profits. Taxes for real. They're claiming here research of 17%. And of course, less than their profits, but it's actually substantially less than that. What do the drug companies mean by research? We talked a little bit about opportunity costs. And also, they include in their research costs the purchase of the license, or sometimes the purchase of the startup company, which they will often do as well. And that's already a developing promised drug. And so is that research, or is that a cost of doing business? The drug companies are required in America, strange place that it is, by law to actually pay user fees to fund the Food and Drug Administration. So here you have a agency designed to regulate the drugs, and the foxes are paying the henhouse to do the regulations. So the drug companies have a mandatory FDA user fee to support the FDA's actions. And that's counted as research. So this blurring of the line, as Dr. Lechner, I think, described this in detail, sending docs to a Caribbean conference to poll them. What do you think about our drug? How do you find it? How do you think this would this advertisement appeal to you? And rather than counting it as marketing, they call it research because they're polling clinicians who they're supporting to go on a trip somewhere. Also, there's outright fraud. In 2007, Roche Corporation was caught by an academic health policy researcher reassigning almost $1 billion Swiss francs from their marketing budget to the research budget. So they actually looked at their statements, which were publicly available, said, well, those numbers are identical. How are you taking it from point A, from one part of the pie chart to another? So all these shenanigans, of course, result in some deserved profit, but the extent of profit is absurd. So here you have a breakdown in terms of taxes. This bar represents how much the pharmaceutical industry, 13 major pharmaceutical companies are spending on research. Here's profit, here's marketing. And again, when it comes to cancer, 10 firms that introduced new cancer drugs reported $9 billion in research and development. They generated almost $70 billion in revenue during that same time. As a consequence, again, the pharmaceutical industry is risk averse to try to study novel molecules. They would rather focus on inventing sort of sure things, which are me too drugs. The drug firms continue to increase US prices after recouping their development costs, much higher than the average of other Fortune 500 companies, 23% versus 7%. So if you look at Big Pharma and those 13 drug companies, this actually was done by the former president of PNHP, Adam Gaffney, and Dr. Letchin. This is research looking at the profits of Big Pharma compared to an average of other American companies. There's a striking difference. Here's another slide also demonstrating longitudinally between 1995 and 2016, the profits in red are the drug companies, the profits of the Fortune 500 on median is in yellow. So clearly it's a very lucrative business. We'll learn a little bit in the next session about why it seems to be so lucrative. Anyhow, another breakdown on prices of sales of selected cancer drugs. Many of you have heard of, maybe seen the advertisements for Keytruda. In red is the profit margin. Actual research and development is in light blue. Distribution, production, which you could see is pretty tiny once you've created the methods. This also applies for Revlimid, which is a thalidomide copy, or Me Too drug. We'll talk about that and other drugs. So in my lifetime, any questions about any of this? Economic questions or other issues? I mean, this is pretty boilerplate, I think, for us. In my lifetime, I was in my residency when AIDS came out. And this was something that was really heartbreaking to see as finally the science caught up with the pandemic. So this is unwarranted drug pricing in a prior pandemic. AZT, partly under the research of Anthony Fauci, by the way, was well. Let me restate this. Anthony Fauci was at the NIH and was involved in its investigation for treatment for AIDS. Let's back up a little bit. AZT was invented actually in the 1960s as an anti-cancer drug. So it's an old molecule found to be ineffective for cancer. The patent was acquired by Burroughs Wellcome back about a decade after its invention in the 1970s. Again, they were thinking about it being a potential antiviral. There was a lot of discoveries at that time about treating herpes infections and shingles and the like. A lot of these agents, acyclovir and valcyclovir, were being studied at that time. They looked at AZT, wasn't successful. They put it on the shelves. AIDS develops. We were working in the ICU at the time, managing patients with unheard of tropical disorders, cryptococcal meningitis, mycobacterial infections none of us had seen, trying to figure out what's going on. The AIDS was determined to be the HIV virus, of course, and the NIH screened thousands of existing antivirals and got a few products from Burroughs Wellcome. Let's see what AZT does among those antivirals. So researchers at Duke and the NIH did the clinical trials, and there were promising results. Great. So Burroughs Wellcome, which owns the patent, repatents it, even though the government was instrumental in discovering its role. And by the way, there were some agreements at the time between cooperative research and development and patents. But because the NIH wanted to get this drug marketed as soon as possible, they said, okay, we're going to forego that patent agreement. We'll allow you to price it as you can, but get it out there as soon as possible. So Burroughs Wellcome repatented it as the first antiviral. It was approved by the FDA. They charged between $8,000 to $10,000 a year, and they did no research on this product. And of course, it was unaffordable for many Americans who had HIV and AIDS. There was a lot of publicity that was basically promoted by the folks who were suffering the most. And it spoke to the immorality of unaffordable, unjustifiable profit over persons. And here's just a picture of one of their activism movements of die-ins held in front of Burroughs Wellcome or government buildings, which was an effective way to make impact and bring this to public's knowledge. So, how we doing? Folks need a break, or we ready to push on? I can't see you all. All right, if you're willing to, of those who I can see, anybody need, okay, should we push on? All right.
Doctor, can
Yes.
I ask a quick question?
Yes.
If we wanted to to learn more about this and the evidence behind the slides, I oftentimes wonder when I
Yes.
see the slides up there, sometimes there's the issues are far too big than just put a simple line.
Yeah.
Is there like a source we can go to like, all right, so if I get questioned on this, I can actually respond with data rather than saying, I trust the person who is telling me.
No,
which, while I may, is unconvincing.
I think that's very important. Some of the stuff, like some of the charts I know offhand because I've gone back to the original article and been able to pull them up. Many of this stuff is from academic papers, by the way. So it's not just from the press reporting this issue. Press often will pick up stuff from academic papers and publish it as an interesting story. What I would do, the simplest way to do this is just do Google. You guys know how to do this. Google Scholar. So let's go back. So to look up, just look up Google Scholar, profits by Burroughs Wellcome versus research costs, something of that sort. So I'm that because I'm afraid this is like the 10th iteration I've given this talk, and I think that many of those references have fallen off the slides. I think that's a very important question. Do trust but verify. So when I don't have sometimes I'll have references here. I think that many of them have fallen off. So sorry about that. But I think that if you have a specific question, I will go through my stuff that I keep on the computer that gets into the chart. I mean, that gets into the slides. But it's probably the simplest. And by the way, things like Bidol, you'll see a lot of different articles. There's controversy on the left about and a lot of people, as we'll see when we design proposals for reform in the pharmaceutical industry. The industry will often have one take on things that's diametrically opposed to what health policy researchers might have. So you do have to be careful to get a balanced effect. I would start with the health policy scholarship, just with Google Scholar, if that makes sense. My cop out.
Thank you. No, you couldn't put all that information on a slide. It would make it unreadable. I mean, so I just want to know where to go next, is basically.
Sure. And you'll see some more. I think I had some references. I think you'll see. The earlier slides do have some references. This stuff about the stories behind the drugs, there's less references. I'm sorry about that. So let's talk about another story about royalties to academia and what the profits look like. So Fosbuvir was the first antiviral for hepatitis C. Again, common problem, great to have cures. Wow, aren't many disorders you can cure with an antiviral. The researchers, and again, there's a lot of stuff in the literature about this story. There were researchers working at Emory University who also got most of their salaries through the Veterans Administration. So they had salaries to do research. Some clinical work, but mostly these folks were biochemists. And they discovered an antiviral named after one of the researchers called sofosbuvir, which was effective for treating hepatitis C. They got NIH funds for $62 million and took some of that funding to form a biotech company to do additional research outside of the Veterans Administration Hospital. The Gilead Corporation said, hey, this is exciting. We're going to buy the rights for the drug that you've studied in animals. You've now done phase 1 trials in people. We want to buy this product. They did. So there was an already developed drugs. Actually, it was phase 1 to 2 that was being done with this startup fund and VA patients. So in 2013, first year that this product was on the market, they made $10 billion in sales. They recouped the about $1 billion it paid to acquire sofosbuvir within that first year of release. Ironically, the Veterans Administration Hospital, where the researchers were getting their salaries, couldn't afford the cost of the drug. So although it was done with many VA volunteers and then patients of the VA system, the VA could not afford it. However, unlike Medicare Part D, it was allowed to negotiate. So it brought, with time, the price of this product to affordable levels. And I'm sorry, this is, I seem to be, let me go back a little bit because I think that was warranted to find. I'm going to have to, sorry. So the drug company basically created a regimen that cost that cost less than $50 to manufacture. The retail price for 12 weeks of treatment was $90,000. So the cost of its manufacture was 2,000 times that. The cost of the treatment was 2,000 that of manufacturing. The other thing is it avoided U.S. taxes by doing the packaging in Ireland and making the pharmaceuticals in Jordan. So go figure, right? Here's something that really disturbed me at the time. I had patients with chronic myelogenous leukemia. So this is a leukemia that develops usually in middle-aged people. Again, what's the story behind this? So this is a fatal disorder caused, interestingly, by a mutation of a single point within the gene that codes for the enzyme tyrosine kinase. Tyrosine kinase controls proliferation of cells. And there was a single point mutation. When you had this mutation, the tyrosine kinase allowed uninhibited proliferation of leukemic cells. The treatment, and I remember having conversation with patients that they need, the pros and cons of bone marrow transplantation. Then Gleevec came out, and I remember patients struggling with trying to figure out could they afford the cost of a drug that would cure them of their disorder. What's the background story on Gleevec and imatinib? NIH, of course, there's a guy by the name of Drucker who decided to screen thousands of molecules. They had done the basic research. They learned what the problem was with tyrosine kinase. They decided to look for tyrosine kinase inhibitors. They contacted Novartis to screen these thousands of molecules. They did the research. They talked with people in the drug manufacturing world. Oh, Novartis had something on the shelves. They had bought the license previously from Sega Geigy. They'd found no use for it, so it was literally getting dusty on back shelves. And reluctantly, Novartis said, okay, we'll give you a few grams of it. And he did clinical trials out in, I think, Seattle in 1998. The molecule had remarkable effects, turned off uninhibited tyrosine kinase, and actually resulted in animal models, and then in the phase 1 and 2 trials, remarkable actual effects in people with very few side effects. And today, tyrosine kinase inhibitors offer actually normal life expectancy and a potential for sustained remission in patients with chronic myelogenous leukemia. It's actually a blockbuster drug. You have to take it every day for a lifetime. It doesn't stop. When you stop taking it, it stops working. But it turns off tyrosine kinase. They found where it fit within the tyrosine kinase molecule. Terrific. Well, as you might expect, so there are some horror stories that follow in terms of the pricing. Having done minimal research, sitting on their shelves forever, Novartis introduced the drug at $26,000 a year. That doesn't seem unreasonable to an extent, but over the course of 12 years, it boosted it to $120,000 a year because they could. As we'll see when we talk about sort of shenanigans in marketing and pricing, they realized that the drug was going to be expending, its patent was going to expire, and a generic was being marketed. They boosted the brand name to $146,000. And I remember this period, again, with many other drugs. Oh, there's a generic coming out. It's going to be less pricey. It's going to finally be affordable. No, it wasn't. When the generic imatinib was released, it was $8,000 a month versus the brand name, which was $9,000 a month. Do I hear anybody using the word cartel? Well, there are drug cartels, and they're in the United States, and they're legal. So these were some of the many generics and alternative tyrosine kinase agents that were discovered over subsequent years. It's easy to find a similar molecule. And ultimately, there were 50 competing FDA-approved tyrosine kinase inhibitors. Costs have come down finally, and with coupons, you could find an imitamib, the initial Levic, anywhere between $4 a pill, that's a pill, to $78 a pill. That's 21 years after first marketed. So we're still talking thousands, that's, do the math, that's a lot of money per year. So this is 21 years after the drug was first marketed for an NIH research drug, which needs to be taken daily for a lifetime. So in speaking about how there's collusion between drug manufacturers, that also applies to generics when it comes to the US. These are the cost of 4 generic tyrosine kinase inhibitors back in 2017. This high bar to the left, of course, it's the US, but that's not for the brand name. Those are for generics, the average cost of these 4 generics. Those same generics in the rest of the world are displayed to the right of the high graph. So this is generic A, generic B, generic C is right here, generic D is right here. They're all priced extraordinarily at ridiculous prices. Bottom line, the profits dwarf the research and development costs in the world of cancer as well. Here's the research and development for cancer drugs. Here's a reference here, which is Prasad, by the way. Here's the research and development costs. Sorry, with including the risk of the product not coming to market. Here's the revenue. So you can obviously see the difference. The way that drug companies work, they're adverse against innovation. They want to make profit rapidly. So there's interesting things, and Gabriella may touch on this. The FDA does not require a new drug be compared to similar drugs to determine relative effectiveness. That's the case in other countries where they have evaluative programs and national programs to say, this drug worked better than that drug. Why would I pay you more for this drug? The FDA does not require that. It only needs to be compared against placebo. Does a drug actually work? So many new drugs offer marginal values and can be easily manufactured with a tweak of a previous molecule. And again, it's not to create extra clinical benefit, but it's to increase profit. And there are estimates here, and this is from Annals of Internal Medicine. Medicare is estimated to be able to save $17 billion over 6 years by substituting 12 older, nearly identical drugs for the newer Me Too drugs that were marketed. And beneficiaries could have saved $1 billion in out-of-pocket costs for those products. And again, there's so many Me Too drugs. So it's cheaper to make them. They're knockoff drugs. Oh, and what's the benefit of having a sixth proton pump inhibitor or a statin or SSRI? Again, it's easy to take. Here's an example. You take omeprazole, which was manufactured first in the pharmaceutical house by Merck. It was easily tweaked to esomeprazole. By the way, the commercials, I remember my patient saying, "Oh, I want the purple drug." The commercials were so effective. This is for Nexium. You guys might not know the names of these products, but I had patients said, "Oh yeah, I know there's omeprazole, but give me Nexium. I really want the purple drug." So what's with Nexium? Nexium was actually less effective. You had to double the dose to get to the same effectiveness of omeprazole, but it was charged at higher costs because the manufacturing was successful. These are all the other generics, for instance, of proton pump inhibitors, requiring the minimal research. So it diminishes the incentive to create new drugs because they're making a bundle by selling these knockoffs. So here's omeprazole, the original molecule. It's basically flipped. They took it as they flipped the original molecule into the L isomer rather than the D isomer. Same molecule worked as well, called it a new drug. No, that's amazing. Anyhow, and charged twice as much, and it was half as effective. So in your lifetimes, clearly, COVID-19 vaccines were a radical exploration of how to take the government and collaborate with the private industry in a national emergency. So in terms of, oh, I hope my slide works here. Yeah. So mRNA vaccines, those are brand new, as you know. They were never released or used in people before 2000 and 2020. However, there had been decades of publicly funded research, some at the University of Pennsylvania, some elsewhere, on creating mRNA vaccines. This is a novel vaccine platform done and the research was all in academia. We have COVID and Congress in desperation, seeing thousands of people in refrigerated morgues in New York City having passed on with this novel virus, designated $10 billion for Operation Warp Speed, which was a collaboration between the NIH and BARDA, the abbreviations of which some of you might know better than I, which is basically a spinoff from the defense industry, and a collaboration with private industry. There are 8 private companies that agreed in advance to manufacture and distribute any of the vaccines that were discovered during this research phase of Operation Warp Speed. Clearly, with the risk of failure, there's high risk of failure creating vaccines, the government said, we will cover the costs of the clinical trials of research and development. Operation Warp Speed would do that. Big Pharma would do a lot of the private funding, as well as venture capital would do that, and private investors, but it was going to be limited because it was a low return on investment for the private industry. So most of the funding was going to be done by the government. Again, some of the history on this here's a reference to some of the history there. Ultimately, to incent private industry to be involved in this process, they eliminated market risks. So the government said, if there's a vaccine that comes out of this, we're going to guarantee we're going to purchase a certain amount of it. We're going to give you a commitment in advance. So the contracts, the details of those contracts required negotiation over how many vaccines would be purchased and what the price would be. But eventually there was a mutually agreeable contract. Also, Health and Human Services guaranteed that they would help with the infrastructure, setting up the factories or using or retooling factories to manufacture those successful vaccines. So a lot of the red tape was eliminated with emergency use authorization through the FDA and a lot of the other streamlining. And these vaccines required a massive government program. But they did mobilize, they coordinated with industry, and they successfully produced essential vaccines with novel methods, mRNA vaccines, at a rate not previously imagined. I don't know how many of you remember the conversation going on with Operation Warp Speed. Oh, we're never going to come up with a new vaccine by next year. But that, in fact, did turn out to be the case. It was pretty remarkable, and I think many of us were impressed. So the Operation Warp Speed was as successful as one could imagine and beyond our imagination. Of course, getting Americans to accept life-saving vaccination politically was another question. They didn't think about that, but that's another story. So I think that was an achievement. And what does it look like in reality? The market experts looked at total market sales for these vaccines as being $124 billion in 2022 alone. And this is data from the Financial Times. The Pfizer vaccine just in 2022 alone was $54 billion. Moderna's was almost $40 billion, or about $1,000 of profit made per second. What really galled me, okay, so we set this up as such. It was pretty remarkable. Okay, a lot of return on your investment. But Moderna, the Moderna company, wanted to fully claim the RNA patents. So they sued the NIH to say that 3 of the scientists actually were not the co-inventors, where it was very clear that the trail of how the invention came to be was very evident. They lost that suit. But the fact that they took out this claim is really remarkable. There's a word for that, it's called chutzpah. Anyhow, these pandemic vaccines were priced as they were because they could. Here's an example of another agent. This is no longer a vaccine. This is a drug called remdesivir, which I remember using and studying back in 2020 before we had much else. Again, basic research on nucleoside analogs was done over many years. This is a drug that targets RNA polymerase in viruses. The funding was $6.5 billion by the NIH. The actual clinical research only cost $71 million. Gilead, when this drug was first introduced, charged $4,600 for a 10-day course intravenously, which was 10 times higher than what was felt to be a reasonable price by the American Clinical and Economic Review, which studies these things. It cost $10 for that 10-day course to manufacture. And here's some references on that. So they're priced because they can. So essentially, the US allows drug companies to purchase proprietary control over the fruits of our taxpayer-funded research, then price gouges those same taxpayers, sometimes when it came to AIDS, literally to death. There is a growing drug access movement, which we'll perhaps talk about further in future lectures, seeking to replace the monopoly patent paradigm with science collaborations, essentially creating a NASA for drugs. You know, one of the things that you'll often hear from the private innovation, quote unquote, pitches made by industry. Just remember, we landed on the moon not because of private industry. Private industry was not involved in the moonshot. It was NASA. So we know that these drugs are currently manufactured without quote unquote innovation from private industry. And one of the first baby steps taken was congressional action with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is now halting the prevention of negotiation between private industry and Medicare for the cost of drugs. So to answer that medical student who asked me, isn't this going to reduce innovation in the American markets? by having restraints on the cost of drugs? The answer is yeah, it will. The CBO estimates that drug pricing by the Inflation Reduction Act will result in 13 fewer drugs between 2023 and 2052 out of a total of 1,300 totally new innovative drugs, or a 1% reduction. Is that is that going to harm the American public? Of course not. So novel molecular entities will continue to be invented, even as Big Pharma normalizes its profits to reasonable levels with some government restraint. Let's talk a little bit about how the pharmacy industry maintains their monopolies over the production of drugs. I'm not going to talk a lot about patents here or legal matters, but essentially I do want to talk about unintended consequences of the Hatch-Waxman and orphan drug legislation, which had, of course, legitimate origins, and how Big Pharma uses that legislation to extend exclusivity, and some recent legislation to outlaw and modify such practices. So, in terms of promoting generics, there was a problem back in the 1970s. There were a lot of drugs that were out there, but the average time for the FDA to approve a generic drug was about 12 years. So there weren't a lot of competitors out on the market after a brand name came out. That is a problem. So Hatch-Waxman was an effort to accelerate the approval process for generic drugs and thereby increase competition and lower drug prices. This was 1984. This is in contrast to Bayh-Dole, which allowed academia to license and receive royalties for new inventions. This was promoting generics. Hatch-Waxman basically designed a new process for generic drugs to apply for FDA approval. This is called an abbreviated new drug application. So basically, the FDA had previously approved the brand drug, and instead of having to do all the clinical trials over again for a generic drug, the intent was to reduce the need for such trials by documenting the bioequivalence of the generic to the reference drug. As an added incentive for generic manufacturers, the legislation would provide half a year of marketing exclusivity to that first generic company that's applying for the abbreviated new drug application. So, sounds good. However, then Hatch-Waxman gives it away to Big Pharma. And essentially, the law treated applying for FDA approval of a generic drug as a trigger for a patent dispute. So basically, the patent law treats and again, I know Gabrielle is going to may touch on this, treats filing of a generic application as an automatic act of patent infringement. And the intent was to allow for the resolution of the patent dispute before the generic drug is marketed. The goal was encouraging early resolution of disputes, but the effect is the opposite. So essentially, and this is a little complicated, but it does apply to why we don't see the generic drugs coming out for our patients when we thought we might. The process is when planning to market the generic, manufacturer must first notify the brand company that they're filing for an abbreviated new drug application. That brand company that holds the patent then has 45 days to decide if they'll sue for infringement of the patent. But that's it's automatic. They will always sue. And when they do sue, the FDA is hand-tied by Hatch-Waxman to not allow approval of that generic abbreviated drug application for an automatic additional 30 days while the parties litigate. Go figure. So the brand manufacturer always sue the generic company for such patent infringement. They get a 30-month extension on their monopoly. And by the way, if they come up with any new patent during that time, they'll also say you're infringing on that patent on that same product. So Hatch-Waxman allows the brand company to obtain up to 3 years of exclusivity. Sorry. In addition, so there's that 30 months of extended monopoly every time a generic company applies. They've already come up with their product, but the brand name manufacturer gets 30 months. Hatch-Waxman, in a different part of the law, also gives 3 years of exclusivity to the manufacturer if they release the product over the counter. So if you ever wonder, and once you start prescribing drugs, you're going to see this. I always wondered, why are they now putting this out over the counter? There's a reason for that. It's because they've timed it perfectly to extend their exclusivity using Hatch-Waxman, if that makes any sense. The growth of generic drug prescribing as drug patents expire has yielded some success. So some of the legislation has increased in the release of generic companies. And in fact, US has more generic drugs as part of its market than other drugs, in part because of how expensive the brand name drugs are. But as a consequence of Hatch-Waxman, we now have an industry of patent extension and anti-competitive practices that is designed to keep generic and brand drug prices high. The cost of some generic drugs has soared even after a sole generic manufacturer has cornered the market. We'll talk about that when it comes to orphan drugs. So the US actually does pretty well, and maybe Hatch-Waxman contributed to that. If we look at the share of dispensed prescriptions within the US drug market in 2019, we exceed that in Canada, Japan, Austria, Belgium, etc. However, if you look at the costs, the share of prescription drug spending for generics is 20%. Remember, we've got a lot of money being expended on unnecessary profit for the non-generics. Again, this is a slide. I don't want to lose you guys on this. It's a little complicated, but this is how a drug is approved by the FDA. We talked about basic research. A patent is granted, as Gabrielle might talk about, on preclinical around the time that you start clinical phase studies. You get phase 1, 2, 3, as we talked about, and pharmacy manufacturer will often buy out the startup after you're now in phase 3. Then you want to market your drug, so you do a new drug application. You submit it to the FDA based on the data from your phase 3 trials, and the drug is approved and marketed. You may have a phase 4 study that's done to look at further side effects, not uncommon. But during this time, after the drug is first approved and marketed, you're doing lots of patent tweaks. After a period of time, when that patent is about to expire, the generic drugs will apply for an abbreviated new drug application. That is, they will be able to prove that the molecule is bioequivalent in its actions without having to do the clinical trials. So how do drug makers game the system to keep their patents from expiring? There's about 4 ways. One is extending the patent just before it expires by developing and patenting altered features of the original product. There's patent thickets, which is where lawyers are well reimbursed, filing copious trivial patents on a drug that really have no significance other than preventing generic companies from suing to be able to manufacture that initial product. There's product hopping, which is just as that patent expires, replacing an older drug with a newer drug and not doing any marketing around the old drug, but as if it disappeared, even though it has not. And then there's pay for delay, which is when the brand company actually pays a generic company to not manufacture the competing drug. Yes, that's legal somehow in the context of a settlement over patent litigation. So prolonging patent protection as old ones expire. Here's an example. The average number of patents has been steadily rising since Hatch-Waxman. So on average, there were 3 patents for the initial drug, but 71 subsequent patents for the 12 top-selling highest revenue drugs. So here's Humira, world's best-selling drug in 2018, lots of profit. When the initial patent expired in 2016, AbbVie applied through the course of this for 247 patents and obtained 137 of those patents, extending its monopoly from 2016 to 2034. Really absurd. Another thing that you should know about, and again, the intent is good, the results are sometimes not so good. In 1983, there was an Orphan Drug Act, which was legislated to reward drug manufacturers for marketing drugs for rare diseases. And a rare disease was defined as 200,000 people as suffering with that disease within the United States longitudinally. Because there's little return on investment, there aren't a lot of manufacturers who might have pursued development, given that limited profit on that limited market. So there's special exclusive rights to have a drug designated for an orphan illness and tax incentives. Here's a great example, thalidomide. I mean, I think, have you all heard of thalidomide? Oh, okay. So thalidomide was a drug manufactured and invented in Europe in the 1950s. It was designed as a sedative and designed to lessen nausea during pregnancy. The Food and Drug Administration basically cut its teeth and earned its accolades by preventing the release of thalidomide in the US. It never approved thalidomide. They had some concerns about teratogenicity, causing birth defects. And so this product was never released in the US, and it resulted in really serious birth defects. A lot of folks who have malformations of limbs or absent limbs. It was a real disaster and catastrophe in Europe, which the FDA prevented. Okay. Well, subsequent research, actually in the US, looking at thalidomide designed for folks who weren't pregnant and for different purposes, found, ironically, it would lessen leprosy. Now, leprosy in the US is a rare disease. So the Celgene Corporation, which, to be fair to them, was forward-thinking, looked at some of this research done, again, not by Celgene, and decided to buy the rights and receive FDA approval as an orphan drug for treatment for leprosy. Terrific. That makes sense. It didn't have the patent, but it bought the rights to it. Well, once they had the rights, they studied it for other purposes, and some of this was done in-house by Celgene. So thalidomide was found to have effects on multiple myeloma. So again, is multiple myeloma a orphan disease? Well, there's 30,000 new patients per year who develop multiple myeloma. People don't survive forever with multiple myeloma, but it's more than 200,000 people in terms of a market. It's actually a market that's, you've got new people who are needing treatment. Really, it doesn't fit in an orphan drug application, but they gained orphan drug approval. And essentially was misapplied. Then, again, they were supposed to have 7 years of exclusivity. They were able to design additional patents, some of which had nothing to do, actually, the majority of which had nothing to do with the actual drug. They were based on the risk evaluation and mitigation system, which prevents the drug from falling into the hands of someone who's pregnant and to prevent birth defects. So they were able to game the system to maintain exclusivity long beyond the time that the orphan drug law was designed to create. What did it do then? It made additional tweaks. So it took thalidomide and created lenalidomide or Revlimid. So just as the patent for thalidomide was expiring, Celgene did product hopping. I remember the ads. They had huge ads. This is the greatest drug known to man for treatment of myeloma and other lymphomas. And this is called product hopping. They no longer marketed the cheaper drug that was losing its exclusivity. Generics could manufacture it. And they said, oh, there's only lenalidomide out there. And as each patent on this newer drug, the Revlimid, expired, they added a new indication. They knew about the indications. They were doing this in the labs. So one indication was, and clinically, one indication was adding a steroid to lenalidomide. Patents expired further. Oh, we've known about it treating mantle cell lymphoma for, the past 10 years, but we're going to wait till the patent expires to then add that indication, which will extend the patent. So essentially, for a drug that they were not involved in inventing, they basically made $7 billion on revenue. And a month's supply of this product made in Europe in the 1950s would cost $5,000 to $9,000. Lenalidomide would be twice that, $18,000. And here's just an example of how extending patents over the course of a drug. This is the 76 patents on Revlimid. And this is a number of patents here. This is the time when the drug is applied and marketed. So it's another example is Suboxone. How many of you have heard of Suboxone? Yeah. So we have an epidemic of substance use disorder in the United States. Suboxone is a very commonly prescribed drug to help folks with their cravings. And it's a combination of naloxone, invented in 1961, and buprenorphine, invented in 1966. That combination was patented by Indivior. And they said, oh, there aren't that many people back in I think this was, there were plenty of people who had substance abuse issues. I think this was 2005 or something like that, or maybe later, maybe on one of the subsequent slides. They got orphan drug protection because they were claiming that they would release this Suboxone only to the clinics that were providing methadone. So they were going to do marketing simply to methadone clinics. Based on that claim, they were given orphan drug protection for 7 years. When it was released and found to be highly effective, oh, well, never mind, we'll allow folks who have training to give Suboxone to prescribe it outside of methadone clinics. And it generated sales of greater than $2 billion. Here's an example of product hopping with what's called a hard switch. Indivior subsequently said, oh, that Suboxone tablet we were manufacturing, they're dangerous. And they raised the price. Kids can overdose on it, and maybe it's and they claim that its pharmacokinetics made it more dangerous, and in fact it really was. They raised the price on the tablet while lowering the price of its orally disintegrating film. They said, oh, the orally disintegrating film is less addictive, it's safer, and they stopped marketing the tablets. That's called product hopping with a hard switch. They no longer marketed the other agent, and they actually took it off the market. That's the hard switch. You couldn't find it anymore. In reality, there's a real problem with these orally disintegrating films. It's one thing for a child to find Suboxone tablets and take it. Kids would find these Suboxone films, adhesives, attached to their bodies. And they were overdosing. So the drug is not safer. You have to be careful in its administration for children as well as adults. And in fact, its pharmacokinetics are not safer. And the Department of Justice indicted and won a settlement from Indivior in 2019 for these false antitrust practices. And by the way, that's all too rare an intervention by the FTC. How about grandfather drugs? So interestingly, there are many products out there that have been out there since the 1800s. Digitalis, colchicine. These are drugs that were invented in aspirin in a former day. What the FDA decided was to grant market exclusivity to those drug makers who are willing to do a study to prove that the anecdotal experience of treating heart failure with digitalis or the anecdotal experience of treating gout with colchicine actually has reality. So they wanted to prove effectiveness and safety of these grandfathered drugs. They decided to use orphan designation to do so. So here is a ACTH, as adrenocorticotropic hormone, which has been used since the 1950s. The biochemistry behind it was quite clear, but it was never studied formally clinically. So the drug makers received a FDA approval in 2010 as an orphan drug. They did minimal additional studies. They did some, but not many. They decided to jack the price up from $1,600 to $23,000 and then $40,000. In the UK, which did not have such legislation, it remains at $523 a vial. Colchicine. Colchicine is a really pretty effective drug for gout. Its price leapt from 9 cents a pill to $5 a pill. And then academia was studying colchicine for a rare disorder, truly was an orphan disease called familial Mediterranean fever. But because it was approved for that new indication, this drug given for colchicine for eons was now given additional 7 years exclusivity because of its use for this rare disease. Gout is not a rare disease. My patients were complaining to me, I can't afford that. You prescribed colchicine. You told me it was going to cost pennies. It was totally unaffordable. Because of different discoveries made by academia, the Takeda company was able to extend its exclusivity. How many of you have heard of Martin Shkreli? So this is really the poster child for abuse in the pharmaceutical industry. He took this product, pyrimethamine, which is an orphan drug for parasitic infections. He bought the patent and licensed it. He brought it from $2 a pill to $750 a pill. And that's really became tragic for patients who had HIV and were having, brain infections. He was jailed, but not because of the gouging of the cost of the drugs. He was jailed for tax fraud. The other stuff is legal. So it's pretty remarkable. Anyhow, let's see, what time do we have here? Doing okay. Then we have pay for delay. So we've talked about maintaining exclusivity. Now we're talking about anti-competitive practices. And basically, this law, Waxman, said, remember, the first generic to declare it as manufacturing will give it that 6 months exclusivity. You got to then go through the suits. During that routine litigation by the brand company will often pay the generic corporation to just not set up manufacturing. Yes, you've proved that you've got a bioequivalent product sitting on your shelves. You might be gearing up to make it and compete with our product, but guess what? We're going to manage an agreement with you to not put it out on the market. Those agreements may not be directly paying them not to make the drug, but indirectly making agreements over some of the other products that that generic company might make, or discussing about royalties or marketing or other remuneration. So of course, why would the generic company refuse such a good deal? They don't have to set up manufacturing, they get paid just the same. And it's also a win-win for the brand name because they're able to maintain exclusivity. There's no competition such that it is. The prices stay high and they share in the brand's monopoly profits. The major losers, of course, are us, consumers. And there's many examples of this. Teva, who had a generic for Effexor, settled during this, quote unquote, settled during the suit to not enter the market until 5 years later. Also Provigil, similar delay in marketing. Endo, Teva, Tecoco, I don't know how to pronounce it, Tecoco, were paid to keep generic versions of Lidoderm off the market. And I saw this as a clinician. I wondered, this drug's been out there for years. This generic must have expired. Why can't my patients afford it? We've talked a little bit, actually probably a lot about Medicare Part D. The major reason for this slide is Part D has a non-interference clause that stipulates that Health and Human Services may not interfere with negotiations between drug makers, pharmacies, and prescription drug plans. It may not require a particular formulary or institute a price structure for the reimbursement of covered Part D drugs. And also the price of such drugs as administered in the doctor's office is set by the average sales price, and Health and Human Services may not touch. That last sentence is in reference to those drugs that are given intravenously or not widely available via a usual market. As you know, this was a major problem with Medicare Part D. And again, as I think we've talked, the former head of Health and Human Services before he became Secretary of HHS, was Alex Azar, who was the CEO of Lilly and lobbied for Lilly with the design of that legislation. Well, that's come to pass, finally. So Part D, with recent reforms, has been eliminated. So we could, any questions about, and some of these questions I might put off to Gabriella, but I think you might have some questions from what I've just presented to you. We were talking about pay for delay, preventing generics from reaching the market, extension of patents. Any questions about that stuff?
I have a question.
Yes.
Are there any laws that are in the process of like being enacted or something, or somebody doing something to close these loopholes that the pharmaceutical industries have found?
Yes. So, and Gabriella, do you know if you're gonna touch on any of that?
I have a few of like patent thicket and like evergreening laws that I was looking at that if that's interesting to people, I can be sure to include in the presentation.
Terrific. So, Danielle, stay tuned. We will be hearing about that. But yes, those are needed for sure. Other questions? So question about legislation, how to address this really egregious action by the pharmaceuticals. All right, you're gluttons for punishment. Here we go. We'll talk a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually eliminates that non-interference clause. So if you're not aware of this, it allows negotiations for 10 drugs. Of course, politically, it's not going to help Biden much. Doesn't start till 2026. And so 10 drugs will be taken out of that non-interference clause and actually regulated, and adds an additional 15 to 20 drugs each year thereafter 2026. The Health and Human Services would be responsible for negotiating the price with the drug companies, and that would be for those drugs made by a single brand name company that don't have competitors, or biologics manufactured which do not have competitors and are covered by Medicare. Those drugs are selected from a list of 50 drugs that have the highest Part D spending, and 50 drugs that have the highest Medicare or clinic delivered drug spending. A maximum fair price would be reached by various criteria, which includes actual research and development costs, the recouping of that, prior federal support for where the discoveries came from with tax dollars, current revenue, sales, cost of production, distribution, and how effective is the drug? They won't select those drugs that aren't particularly helpful, by the way, but also they will be granting more profit to those drugs that were marketed that have true therapeutic advance. And there is some sticks rather than carrots, which is an excise tax if drug companies don't comply with the legislation. These are some of the drugs that may, so these are very commonly prescribed drugs. Apixaban will be among them, Farxiga, and Entresto for heart failure. And I'm going to go through this quickly. Which drugs cannot be, now in other countries, in every other country that's got a developed system, they will be looking at all drugs that enter formularies in terms of their prices. But the vast majority of American drugs will be protected from this negotiation process. That includes any drug that has not been out on the market for more than 7 years. So they're given 7 years of exclusivity, unlike any other country, before restraint on profit could be made. That's the case with most pills or small molecule drugs. For biological drugs, often infused intravenously, I think that's changed to 13 years. They're given 13 years of exclusivity. So none of those drugs that haven't been out that long will be part of this process. And again, if it's a product that doesn't incur a lot of expense to Medicare, it will not be included. And those orphan drugs that we were just discussed will not be included. The HHS will not use this was put in by the right. This was a bone thrown to conservatives. Shall not use evidence from comparative clinical effectiveness research that treat. Well, I'm not sure. Actually, I'm not sure this is to the right. This is maybe I take that back. Part of the legislation is that they won't do comparative clinical effectiveness research to see if a drug extends the life of elderly versus disabled versus terminally ill, or is of lower value than extending the life of an individual who's younger, non-disabled, or terminally ill. This is a lot of, basically, the reason I mentioned conservative issues is they don't want to actually look at quality of life years gained. So when it comes to chemotherapies, we've discussed this, you can get a quality of life year gained by a really effective drug that will give you 10 years of life expectancy versus a non-effective drug that will give you 3 months of life expectancy. I think this was an effort to exclude that kind of comparative evaluation. This actually makes sense. This is protecting disabled or terminally ill or elderly to an extent from exclusion, using this for that purpose. Anyhow, these are some of the drugs that will be first restrained. And also, second part of this is limiting arbitrary price increases by a manufacturer of a brand name drug. That's also part of the IRA. Now, Medicaid, again, is allowed to negotiate price increases, but the IRA requires a drug maker to pay a rebate to the federal government if its exclusive drug that's covered under Part D price increases faster than the rate of inflation. Another element that we touched on with the Inflation Reduction Act was the limit the cost of insulin. So the out-of-pocket costs, cost sharing, out-of-pocket costs in this matter, is limited to $35 for Medicare beneficiaries and eliminates any deductible. The side effect of this was this got extended into the non-Medicare population as well. There's other capping on out-of-pocket drug costs that were part of the IRA and other issues. So this is just the timeline requiring drug companies to pay rebates right off the bat if a brand name exclusive drug manufacturer is raising its prices higher than inflation. Right off the bat, this happened in 2023. The cost of insulin out-of-pocket costs were reduced to $35 a month. and also coverage of additional vaccines. So there's a lot of legislation that was under the Inflation Reduction Act. Not until 2026 does that exclusivity on negotiation for Medicare kick in, but then it'll be ongoing thereafter. This is just some of the savings that CBO estimates with these provisions, which are fairly considerable overall effect on the budget between 2022 and 2031. And this is Medicare. Overall, for the large part, maybe some of it is the ACA, will be $236 billion. And by the way, again, in terms of that medical student's question, how is this going to affect innovation? Well, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that under the IRA, between 2023 and 2032, there may be one drug that is not released, and ultimately 13 drugs over the long tenured process of 1,300 drugs, or 1%, would not be approved over the next 30 years. That ain't affecting innovation very much. So 1% of new products, and that is not necessarily breakthrough drugs. And this is a government estimate on its effects. It's not perfect. There are problems. Negotiations is restricted to drugs which don't have generic versions. It's restricted for 7 years. Modification of the IRA to only include those drugs with meaningful market share should be performed as well. It doesn't talk about the launch pricing of these drugs. It talks about inflation, but not the initial prices. And part of that absence in negotiation may result in drug manufacturers boosting their first launch prices to make up for the fact that they can't exceed inflation. So there are plenty of problems. It's not a cure-all. It's a step in the right direction. Bringing it back to the clinical, just in terms of the patients, I mentioned the exorbitant prices of insulin for my patients. The fact that there was a cartel of drug manufacturers, Sanofi, Lilly, and another company, AstraZeneca, all marketed their drugs at the same cost and climbed in the same fashion, which is really anti-competitive. And I think Gabriella may touch on that. It's quite extraordinary. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction here. The downstream effects of the IRA and public pressure were really effective. Caps on insulin prices for the non-Medicare population were effective. Remember, I mentioned California was threatening to manufacture insulin on its own. So lo and behold, after the IRA was passed, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk were the first two insulin manufacturers to say, oh, we're such good guys. We're going to reduce the out-of-pocket cost for our drugs at $35 per month. So that they immediately made that. Then Sanofi, 2 days later in March of 2023, oh, we're going to also cap the cost of our drugs. We're going to market it at $35 a month for people with private insurance. And so essentially those three drug manufacturers accounted for 90% of the insulin market. They promoted themselves out of the goodness of their hearts, but they saw the writing on them. I think we might be discussing, other folks might be discussing the FDA. I think I touched on the fact that the FDA's budget is accomplished through the manufacturers who use it to do its regulation. So it's kind of nuts. There's all sorts of bills to change that. One is called the 21st Century Cures Act. And we've seen evidence where the experts on guideline groups seem to have influence to allow a drug to get approved when really the evidence for releasing it was poor. In my experience as a geriatrician, that was very much the case with Aduhelm or aducanumab, which is a drug for Alzheimer's disease, which really had major side effects of intracerebral bleeding and negligible effects on Alzheimer's. So that's now been taken off the market. There was a lot of criticism of why this drug ever came to be released to start off with, and a lot of that was felt to be problems with adequate regulation. So I think that's what I got here.